Welcome to Now for Someone Completely Interesting. I'm your host, Ben Poulin. There's been a few guests that I've had on this podcast that I met for the first time when we were recording this, and so I got to know them that way. And while I can say I've known my guest here for a few years, I'm a bit embarrassed to admit I really don't know my guest that well. But that's what I like best about this show. She's been recommended by several past guests, including her husband, who's been on the show twice, and several listeners have come up to me and told me we really have to get her on. Tanya is well known in and around the St. Paul community because of her volunteer work and involvement with St. Paul's Truth and Reconciliation Initiative and Indigenous relations in the area. As her husband Colin put it, she has 100% Ukrainian heritage and is fluent in Cree. That's just the tip of the iceberg here for my guest, the brains behind the beer names at the Lakeland Brewing Company, Tanya Fontaine. Thanks so much for joining me, Tanya.
Oh, you're welcome. It's an honor to be here.
I'm glad you feel that way. So, like I said in the intro, I mean, there's a few things I do know about you that we'll get into, especially with learning to speak Cree fluently. And while I don't have a huge following, I do have a world-renowned following. So, just to clarify, the Cree language is the language of our local Indigenous people. To clarify that. So, all right. So, like I said, I don't know you very well, but I always like to start maybe at the beginning. You're born and raised in St. Paul.
Not exactly.
Not exactly? Okay, there we go.
Exactly.
Perfect. Let's start there.
Yeah, I moved to St. Paul when I was 4.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd like to say this whole Cree language journey that I've been on was kind of like an accident, a bunch of accidents that all aligned.
Right.
So, I was 4 when I moved here with my mom. My mom was a single parent, and she had come to St. Paul for a job.
Okay. And where did she move from?
So we moved from Kindersley, Saskatchewan.
Oh, wow. Okay. So a little bit of a jaunt then.
Yes.
What was the job that brought her here?
She's a teacher.
Okay, perfect.
So she got a job at the Catholic school system. It was more like she wasn't really sure she'd get the job, being recently divorced,
right,
and working for a Catholic school, but they needed teachers, and she thought she'd try it for a year. Perfect. And ended up staying longer because she fell in love and met a local man here, and so that's how I have come to have a French last name.
Okay, there you go.
Because my stepfather, who I never referred to that way, always called him my dad, he adopted me, and the French Fontaine family adopted me when I was 7. And so I have actually 100% Ukrainian ancestry.
Right. I'm glad you explained that. So when Colin said that, I was like, Fontaine, that's more associated with French, right? So thank you for clarifying that. So essentially, though, you moved here when you were 4 years old. You grew up in St. Paul. You can talk to 10 people who grew up in and around the same town at the same time, and they'll have 10 very different perspectives. So what was your view of growing up in and around St. Paul?
Well, my experience, coming from somewhere else, I really remember I have dark skin, and as a kid, people often mistook me for having Cree ancestry or Métis ancestry, which I didn't have. When I was in Kindersley, back in Saskatchewan, the town was predominantly German and English. And so people thought I was Italian over there. When I moved up to St. Paul, all of a sudden, this switch, the focus on the color of my skin became less desirable. There was times when people treated me less than because of this dark skin. So I always had this kind of curiosity about Cree people. On the playground, I had my first experiences with Cree were just the accent. I picked up the Cree accent from my playmates on the playground. My parents noticed this, and I remember being in grade 2 and kind of laughing. They were laughing at me kind of because I had this Cree accent. Nobody in my family spoke Cree.
Right.
But I also remember, saying often, I'd come home crying because there was this negative connotation associated, and my mom didn't know what to say to me. She was tired of me coming home with the same story. Mom, they're calling me this and that. And so finally she just said one day, well, what if you were? And that just kind of put a stop to it because, she said, you know who you are. And, what do the little kids who are Cree, what do they come home
exactly.
saying?
Yeah.
You know, so this mistaken identity kind of created this curiosity in me, with my Cree neighbors, you know,
Right.
from the area. Yeah.
So is that essentially because of that curiosity? Is that how you learn to speak Cree fluently? Or is this something that?
No, it's more accidents. More
Right.
accidents happen. So I grew up here. Like I was raised on the farm. My mom was a teacher. I had a certain amount of privilege, and ended up accidentally at a job interview at the Manawanas Friendship Center
Right.
in town. A friend of mine was going for a job,
Yeah.
and he said, just come and wait for me. I'm kind of nervous or whatever. So when I went there, someone didn't show up for their interview, and they just pulled me into the room. Yeah. So, and I didn't even know what it was about, and I think it might have been targeted for, at-risk youth.
Right.
And so there I was, kind of whatever, I was there.
Yeah.
And I got a job at the Friendship Center, and they started running culture camps. So I
Okay.
was there the first year that the Friendship Center had their culture camps back in, what would this be? 85, 86
Wow.
sometime. Yeah.
I mean, it's when you say accident, literally was this ongoing mistaken identity. You're here for the interview, right?
Yeah, I think so.
We went through this just a little bit before we started recording. You have quite an extensive credentials and education background, Master of Education, BA in criminology. Did any of those factor in like at the time when you had, or did these degrees come after you had the job there and got involved with
It kind of things, just like I say, honestly, one accident after another. So after that, I was at, worked 2 summers for the Friendship Center, really enjoyed it, got exposed to teachings from elders, a whole different philosophy and mindset that I never knew existed. You can read about Indigenous culture or Cree culture or Nehiawewen, the Cree language, but being kind of immersed in that setting and hearing, I had, and I wasn't looking for those teachings. I wasn't
Right.
looking for a new anything. It was just kind of available to me, and I was again, probably because of that mistaken identity.
Yeah.
I had a little more curiosity. Well, why do we live differently? Why is it like this? And feeling a connection still because of that mistaken identity. So I went into university, and I went in with a language deficiency. I got into a tiff with my French teacher. I'd studied French, being from St. Paul,
Yeah.
from grades 2 to grade 10. And in grade 10, my French teacher made fun of me speaking. And so I didn't want to take French anymore.
Right.
So I didn't, and I got into university and realized that I needed a language other than English. So I was going to take Spanish, like most people. And then I was going through the catalog and all, back in the day when you actually had a book. And I saw Cree.
Right.
And I said, hey, I know a few words from St. Paul and from the Friendship Center camp and from the playground. I'm going to take Cree. So I enrolled in Cree language at university.
And what university was that at?
University of Alberta.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I was told later on, Alice Quinney told me later on that they just developed the program. So
Okay.
it just they just had Cree accepted. She fought to have Cree accepted as a
Right.
language other than English. So I was kind of fortunate that way. And I got in to my class at U of A, where I met Emily Hunter, who was the Cree language teacher back then, and started that journey.
I just, it explains so much about why you're involved the way you're involved and the way everything intertwines. But it makes me think back to when you said when you were younger and you go home and you're upset about it and your mom says, well, what if you are? Is that something that just puts I guess in the frame of mind that you're just open to kind of whatever happens, and it seems like you kind of go with the flow and then things develop from there. Would you say that's
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, because like I say, I really wasn't looking
Right.
for all of this. Things just kind of lined up, and it happened.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same thing with Cree language. Like when I got into the classroom, I wanted to prove I had something to prove. I had to learn this language, and my bad experience with French gave me a little more impetus to try hard.
Right.
And I'll never forget. So I'm in class, and trying to check out to see how much Cree everybody knows, and all of a sudden this one lady walks in and she speaks fluent Cree to the instructor, and she answers her fluently. And I'm sitting there and I was just, how am I supposed to compete with this woman? And I was mad and I was angry, and I went home and I was just like, this is not fair, you know? So, but what am I going to do? So I'm like, well, she's going to know all the answers. I got to sit next to her.
Right.
So immediately I got to change my mind here. And I sat next to that woman. And as it turned out, we are good friends today, and we actually co-facilitate right now for Portage College. We co-facilitate their Cree language course. We developed and did that. But back in the day, this was back in, like I say, the late 80s, early 90s, she helped me with the pronunciation. So, people will make fun, like, if you look at how Cree's written and you use the Roman orthography, like the English letters, you can mispronounce it. Like people mispronounce Musqueam all the time. They call it Masqueam.
Yeah.
And it just grates on my ears, because it's not. It's, Musqueam. So, you hear like tanse neto temtic when it's tanse and to temtic,
Right.
And so she helped me with all those fine things that I never heard with my English mind. And then I helped her with the grammar part. Because so many of Cree language speakers, fluent speakers, were coming into the Cree language program and failing.
Oh.
And it wasn't because they didn't know the language, it was because they didn't know grammar and grammar structure. So I had linguistics courses behind me. I had studied French for 8 years. And that enabled, Connie and I to really help each other out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I almost feel like this would be a shorter podcast if we talk about what you don't know.
Well, I do love Cree language, and I can talk and talk and talk forever. So yeah.
That's good. And actually, to illustrate the point, I pulled up, and you were talking to some people just outside of the Lakeland Brewing here, where we're at right now. And of course, I overheard. You were only a few feet away, but I could hear you speaking Cree to the folks that you were talking to. So, is it? I find through, like, if you think about a lot of Indigenous languages throughout the world, there's a lot of with minority cultures that they're losing their language. And I know this is a concern in and around here, but do you think that based on what you know and where you've gone with it, is this a trend that's starting to reverse as far as people retaining the language and maintaining it? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if it's reversing yet. And I guess it would depend on where you are.
Right.
So I've done lots of studying on language revitalization, keenly interested in it, but I think there's still a long ways to go. And I think English is just too prevalent right now.
Right.
So you see a lot of people scrambling to, to bring it back.
Yeah. And I think even if you go beyond our borders, like South America is predominantly Spanish, where there's a lot of Indigenous people down there that I don't know if they even have their traditional languages anymore that is around, which is kind of a sad thing that those things, that could be gone forever in some areas. So
yeah, it's critical. That's what I always said when I started. I can go to Ukraine to learn my language, and but the Cree people here, like, this is it. This is where their language is. So it's very, and that's part of why I became interested in helping.
Mm-hmm. Is this when you learn the language and some of your associations? Is that where you got the initiative to become more involved with the truth and reconciliation that's going on here? We've had some guests talk about it in the past, like Pierre Lamoureux, I know, is involved with it. My Uncle Herman's involved with it, and I think it's a pretty I think gaining momentum around and awareness and stuff like that. So I maybe just talk a bit about your involvement and how you became involved with it.
Sure. So I started, I guess, at university. I actually was in Native Studies, in the Faculty of Native Studies, and transferred out and finished with a criminology degree because I didn't want to take a job from an Indigenous person. And so I had studied Indigenous history, and I mean, that was back again in late 80s, early 90s, when we didn't study that in school. We didn't have that information. So I guess that became part of my interest in reconciliation in St. Paul, and in St. Paul being a historically significant area. The Frog Lake Resistance happened. St. Paul de Métis was formed here. Was one of the only Métis reserve in Canada. So it's we come from in St. Paul this really rich history, and yet I had only heard about it at U of A in Edmonton, which was shocking to me. So I kind of you can't speak Cree unless you're with Cree people.
Right.
And I was adopted into Emily Hunter's family. Emily Hunter adopted me. It turned out my Cree teacher, she was my Cree teacher from U of A, was originally from Goodfish here. And so I was fortunate that way to get to, and I was able to commit, a year or two of my life to, going to Saddle Lake and Goodfish and being around the language and taking part in ceremonies and whatever opportunities I could to learn more practice the language.
Right.
And so then when I went to do my master's, I took a lot of anti-racist training and a lot of education about history of colonialism and oppression.
Right.
And so, one of the things that became clear was, regardless of how much Cree I knew or how many times I was adopted by people, as a non-Indigenous person, as a white person, I have a responsibility, to addressing these historical wrongs, even though I didn't actually do these things. And I'm pretty far from feeling, well, I'm pretty immersed, I guess, into a lot of Cree culture, but that doesn't change the fact that I have a responsibility. So that kind of became a question for me. Okay, what am I gonna do? What's my responsibility? And I could see that it's not up to Indigenous people. Reconciliation isn't their job, it's our job as non-Indigenous people, as people coming to this land. This land was inhabited before we got here. That's a big pill to swallow, even for myself. I had to come to terms with land acknowledgements that were being made. Well, I'm like, if I'm standing up and I'm saying I'm on Treaty 6 territory, what am I saying? What do I mean? So I went into a lot of self-exploration, and with that whole notion that we're complicit in ongoing colonization, and it's like, wow, that's a lot. That's heavy stuff. So I was like, well, I got to do something, and the 2015 TRC was coming out, the Truth and Reconciliation Report was coming out, and I was at Blue Quills going to study Cree language. I started, I think, in 2012.
Right.
And so one of the things that I did was I was a professional photographer for a while, for a couple years. In amongst all of that.
Where did you find the time?
I asked that now. So I decided to host an art exhibit. So I met this gentleman, the guy actually who you saw me talking to outside here. I met him at Blue Quills, and he was a wheelchair user. He had a spinal cord injury, and he didn't have a vehicle, and he would have to pay for rides to get to school. And I was really completely blown away by his motivation, his generosity, and his whole spirit. He wanted to learn, and he got himself to school. And I couldn't imagine being without my car, and I'm able-bodied. And here's a guy in a wheelchair who doesn't have a car. So I said, I want to host a fundraiser for him. So I had a photography exhibit, and I had named all my pieces in Cree and put them in Cree syllabics as well. And I had a 2-weekend event and raised $4,200, and he was able to get a vehicle and hand controls.
Awesome.
So that was my first kind of giving back, and it was interesting because I never realized how our two communities don't do that. We don't come together. We don't connect. Here's a white lady from St. Paul and a Indigenous man, a Cree man from Saddle Lake, And, we had this relationship. So we crossed those lines that kept our community separate, that kept fundraising efforts separate,
Right.
because I checked around, well, what is there for him? And there was really nothing that he could access with these, again, when we talk about colonial structures, people kind of get offended right away and jump to conclusions, but that's like, well, the federal government funds him, so he doesn't qualify for anything provincial. He doesn't qualify for, for this, for that.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about. Like those kind of things get in the way. So that was my first kind of stepping out and into my community and going on record as, I think it's important that I do this.
Right.
Not everybody has to do what I'm doing, but that I'm doing something. Then I hosted 2 more exhibits in 2015 when the TRC came out. I hosted one where I instead of my own work being shown, I contacted Indigenous artists in the area.
Right.
And I organized an art exhibit for them. And again, we had a place where people could come together, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. We could have tea. We could look at an art piece, a nice friendly environment, a nice safe environment, and build relationship. So nothing more like, we don't have to talk about racism. We don't have to talk
Right.
about colonization. We don't have to talk about land. We can just talk about maybe what we have in common instead. And that's always been my kind of take on this, is if we see each other as humans, then we're less likely to be hurtful to each other on both sides.
And I'm really glad you explained it and took the time to explain it, because I think a lot of what's out there, even when we're talking about truth and reconciliation, is at the forefront is always the issues of colonization and racism. And no matter what your intentions are, those have negative connotations on both sides. And I think that takes away from what can be done positively. So bringing that to our attention, I think, is important, that it's not just about the negative connotations too, but doing the things that we should just be doing as human beings, period. And there shouldn't be those lines that we know exist. So it's very enlightening to me right now. So that's people try to explain it, but I think you kind of have a really good way with words, I guess you could say, to explain it that way. So I'm glad you did that and took the time to do it. So I appreciate it.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Just wanted to say that. So,
Yeah.
With regards to you've learned Cree language, do you ever teach it?
Well, I do. Now, again, even this is, again, part of my journey as being a white person and knowing Cree language. It's not always welcomed, right?
Right.
Because I've learned something that was taken from people. And so some people don't see it as a good thing. Or the other thing is, I don't want to take up space. Like, I don't want to. So I've refused a lot of opportunities to teach Cree. I did teach Cree at elementary school because it was January, and I took a contract for 6 months to teach grade 4 and 5 Cree because they were stuck.
Right.
And that's after that I went to Blue Quills to learn more Cree, and I did more subbing after that. I'm like the Peggy Hill of the Peggy Hill of Cree language. So Peggy Hill was
You're right in my kitchen on that one, because I love King of the Hill.
There you go. Yeah, and so I do. I love to teach it. I love to share. Like, if I can help anybody learn, like if I can make it easier for anybody. Like, it's hard. It's anybody who's learned another language. I mean, unless you learned it as a child, it's not easy to learn as an adult. So I want to help people, and I don't want to take up space though for. I don't want to take a job for a Cree language teacher, take someone else's job. But I did get asked, so I said the only way I would do it is if I could do it with a fluent speaker, and they agreed. So I do teach Cree, I co-facilitate, and I find that to be really rewarding and really it satisfies that integrity part on my side of how far I'll go, or I don't want to be in spaces where I'm not welcomed.
Right.
And as it turned out, my friend from university way back agreed to do that with me. So we teach Cree for portage, and we have the perspective of a learner and the perspective of a fluent.
Right.
Yeah.
The education background, one thing jumped out at me when I went through your LinkedIn page, and I'm sorry, this goes a little bit more off topic than what we've been on right now. Psychological first aid. I've never heard of that. Like my horizons are broadening by the second here.
Well, I think that was the first year St. John's Ambulance had, they created a course called Psychological First Aid.
Okay.
Because of traumatic experiences.
Right.
And people not responding properly.
Right.
And because there seemed to be so much more trauma and happening nowadays.
Right.
So they wanted to create a course, for looking after people, and what to say to people who are in an accident,
right.
and or school shootings or
right.
these different types of things that happen now.
So more psychological injury or just witnessing an event and the trauma that can cause. I'm
Exactly.
So non-physical. Okay, I kind of thought that's what it was, but it's like I said, I've never seen that before, and that's so. I mean, how are you finding these?
Here, I thought you were going to talk about moose hide tanning, because that's actually something else that I really, really got hooked on. So,
I did notice that as well. But you know what? That we might have to tackle that on a whole other podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
But yeah, I mean, no, the recommendation to have you on was very very much well deserved, and we were very much overdue to have you on this podcast. And I am 100% sure that, I mean, if I can have Colin on twice, I can probably have you on 5 or 6 times easily here to talk more, but we'll wrap it up here. And I don't know if you've listened to a lot of these, or if you know this question's coming, but it's the one question I ask every guest. You're here on a show called Now for Someone Completely Interesting, because as you've showed us, you are completely interesting. But if there was someone you would recommend for this podcast that comes to mind, who would that be?
Oh boy. Dennis Steinhauer.
Okay.
Dennis Steinhauer. Can I recommend 2?
Sure.
And Diana Tyler Moon.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Do you want to give a brief explanation as to why, or do I have to do some investigating on this?
Dennis Steinhauer was we took the Cree language program together at Blue Quills, and he works in town here at the Friendship Center.
Okay.
And he's a very skilled group facilitator. Yeah.
Awesome.
I have a lot of respect for him. And Diana Tyler Moon has been in town for many years. She's been associated with community adult learning. Mm-hmm. And she has a very, very interesting, it's always interesting how people end up here.
Right.
And yeah, I won't say any more, but she has an interesting story, I think.
That's where I come into the picture then. So thank you so much for that. My guest here again is Tanya Fontaine. Like I said earlier, the brains behind all the names of the beers at Lakeland Brewing Company here. And again, thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you give us a like and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider. You can find us by searching Pool and Radio or Now for Someone Completely Interesting. And again, my guest, Tanya Fontaine.